The floor was hard and cold, which was nothing new. Harry had slept on floors before. The cupboard under the stairs had a floor after all, and he'd been acquainted with it for most of his life. But this particular floor was stone, and it sat on a rock in the middle of the North Sea, and the storm outside had been trying to tear the hut apart for the better part of 3 hours, and he was 11 years old, and there was no cake. He'd thought about the cake. Couldn't help it. Dudley was snoring on the only real mattress, a fat and satisfied lump under 2 blankets, while Harry lay wrapped in a single thin one that smelled faintly of motor oil. The hut around them shook with every gust, rain hammering the walls, and Harry stared at the ceiling, what little he could see of it, given that his glasses were tucked inside one of Dudley's cast-off trainers so they wouldn't be stepped on, and thought about birthday cake. He had drawn the number 11 in the dirt of the floor earlier, before the light failed completely. Just scraped it there with one finger while Uncle Vernon was barking orders about sleeping arrangements, and Aunt Petunia was dragging Dudley away from the window. 11, because that was what he was as of today, and nobody had mentioned it, and he supposed drawing it in the dirt was at least something. A record. Evidence that it had happened at all. When the knock came, it wasn't how he'd imagined the end of the evening would go. He'd half expected nothing. That was what you got when you were Harry Potter living with the Dursleys. But the knock wasn't nothing. The knock was enormous, the kind of sound that rearranged the air inside your chest. And then the door didn't so much open as cease to exist. Harry scrambled upright, jamming his glasses on. The man in the doorway was the largest Harry had ever seen, possibly the largest that existed. He had to duck to fit through the space where the door had been, and even ducking, his shoulders nearly touched both sides of the frame. He was soaking wet, rain streaming down a wild black beard that might have housed a family of owls, his hands like dinner plates wrapped around a pink umbrella, his beetle-black eyes scanning the room until they found what they were looking for. "Harry," said the man, "loss's time I saw you. You were barely big enough to hold. You've got your mother's eyes." Behind him, Uncle Vernon had gone very still in the doorway of the back room. "Who are you?" Harry said, because it seemed like the right question, and because asking it was easier than dealing with the peculiar feeling in his chest, a sort of recognition that didn't make logical sense, a warmth that had no business being there. "Rubeus Hagrid," the man said, straightening up as much as the ceiling allowed, which was not very much. "Keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts." He reached into his coat, a coat so enormous it could have been a tent with buttons, and produced an envelope. "And I've got a letter for you." Uncle Vernon made a sound like a man who'd swallowed something sideways. "Now see here. You sit down," Hagrid said, pleasantly. He wasn't looking at Vernon. He crossed the room in 2 strides, held the envelope out to Harry with those enormous hands, and when Harry took it, yellowed parchment, his name written in emerald green ink, address reading. The floor, the hut on the rock, the sea. He couldn't quite help the way his fingers tightened on it. He pulled out the letter inside and read it. He read it twice. "I'm a what?" he said finally. "A wizard," Hagrid said, folding himself down to sit on the stone floor beside Harry, which still put him at roughly eye level with a standing adult. "And a famous one at that. Blimey, Harry. Didn't you ever wonder where you came from? Didn't you ever think it were odd, all the strange things that happened around you?" Harry thought about the time he'd ended up on the school roof when running from Dudley's gang. He thought about the teacher whose hair had turned blue. "Sometimes," he said. "Well, there's a reason for it." Hagrid looked at him, and something in his expression softened around the edges, became careful. "Harry, your parents were a witch and a wizard. The very best, both of them. They were killed 11 years ago, nearly. The hut had gone quiet except for the rain. Killed, Harry said. That's not what the Dursleys told me. No, it wouldn't be. Hagrid said it with a gentleness that had iron underneath. They'd have told you a car crash. That's what they told everyone. But it wasn't. It was a dark wizard. The darkest there's ever been, Harry. He tried to kill you too. Harry's hand went, without quite meaning to, towards the scar on his forehead. He'd had it forever. The Dursleys had never explained it satisfactorily. Now, he tried and he failed, Hagrid said, watching him. Because of your mother. What she did, died to protect you. It left a mark on him, and on you. A mark he couldn't overcome. That's why you're famous, Harry. That's why every witch and wizard in Britain knows your name. You survived something nobody ever survived before. Harry sat with that for a moment. He was 11, sitting on a cold stone floor in the middle of the sea, holding a letter that said he was a wizard, being told that his parents hadn't died in a car accident but had been murdered, that the murderer had then tried to kill him next, that something his mother had done, had died. Doing had stopped it. It was a great deal to sit with. Is it true? He said at last. Every word, Hagrid said. All right. Harry looked at the letter again, then up at Hagrid. Then where is their gold? It was a practical question, and he understood it might not sound like the right one. But Harry had been thinking practically his whole life. The Dursleys had not been the sort of people who allowed for much else. If his parents were gone, there was a question of what they'd left behind. A question, now that he considered it, that nobody had ever let him ask. Hagrid looked mildly surprised. They had a vault at Gringotts. That's the Wizarding Bank. Safest place in the world for keeping your gold. It's yours now, of course. What's in it? Right, Harry said. He filed that away. And Sirius Black? The name had been in his head for 3 years, and he couldn't have said precisely why. He'd found it written on the back of a photograph, the only photograph he'd ever seen of his parents, creased and water-stained, and discovered behind a loose floorboard in the cupboard. To Lily and James. Always. Espy. And when he'd tried to ask who Espy was, Aunt Petunia had gone rigid, and Uncle Vernon had taken the photograph away, and that had been the end of that. But the name had stayed. Hagrid went very still. It was a small stillness, the kind a person did when they were deciding something. Harry had gotten good at noticing that sort of thing. Best left alone, thys, Hagrid said finally. Fair now. There's more important things to think about. He was already reaching back into his enormous coat, those great hands emerging with something wrapped in white paper, slightly squashed. Happy birthday, Harry. Made it myself. The cake was chocolate and lopsided, and someone had written, Happy Birthday, Harry, in green icing, and it was, without question, the best birthday cake Harry had ever seen, because it was the only birthday cake Harry had ever had. He ate it sitting on the cold stone floor, while Hagrid told him about Hogwarts and wands and Diagon Alley, about moving staircases and talking portraits, and a game played on broomsticks in the air. Somewhere in the middle of it, Uncle Vernon gave up and disappeared into the back room. Somewhere after that, Dudley woke up long enough to try to take a piece of cake, and Hagrid pointed the pink umbrella at him in a way that made Dudley reconsider with impressive speed. Harry ate the rest without interruption. He fell asleep much later, curled under his thin blanket with the floor still hard beneath him, the letter tucked inside his shirt against the warmth of his skin, listening to Hagrid's snoring rattle the remaining windows. Sirius Black, he thought, on the soft edge of sleep. He turned it over, watched it in his mind, the way Hagrid had gone still at that name. the careful choosing. Best left alone. More important things. The redirect to cake and birthdays and Hogwarts, the enormous hands producing the squashed parcel with a speed that had nothing to do with clumsiness and everything to do with decision. Whatever Sirius Black was, whatever that name meant, whatever it had cost Hagrid that small moment of stillness, it was the sort of thing that made a man who had just knocked a door off its hinges without blinking decide that tonight was not the time. Harry thought, "I'll ask again when there's more time." He closed his eyes, and the storm kept on, and the letter pressed warm against his chest, and he slept. The morning came grey and salt-smelling, the storm blown out sometime before dawn. Harry lay on the floor, listening to the sea and to Hagrid's breathing, which was less snoring now, and more the deep, rhythmic percussion of a man who slept like geology, certain of his own foundations. The letter was still inside his shirt. He had not taken it out in the night to read it again, because he had not needed to. He already knew what it said. He already knew what it meant. Hagrid had produced a kettle from somewhere inside his coat and had it boiling on the hut's ancient stove before Harry had properly sat up. The tea was extremely strong and came in a mug the size of a small bucket. There were crackers from the night before. Harry ate them and drank the tea and watched the light change on the water. "We'll get something proper in London," Hagrid said. The boat back across the water was a different journey from the night before. Without the storm, the crossing was merely cold and spray-soaked, and Harry sat in the bow, watching the hut on the rock grow smaller behind them. He had slept on that floor. He had turned 11 on that floor, with a number drawn in the dirt. He had been told things on that floor that had changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. He turned back around and looked at the sea ahead of them instead. The hut on the rock was not a place he would miss, but the fact of having been there, of having turned 11 on that floor, of having been told impossible true things in the middle of a storm, that was something he would carry for a long time, and he knew it. Vernon Dursley was on the shore when they landed. He got as far as "Now, I absolutely forbid," before Hagrid unfolded himself from the boat. After that, Vernon did not say anything further. He watched Harry follow Hagrid up the beach and said nothing at all, and his silence was a thing of great personal achievement. Harry did not look back. London moved around Hagrid the way water moves around a very large rock. Pedestrians rerouted without apparently noticing they were doing it. Harry walked in the space this created and found it oddly comfortable. People in cities had a practiced skill at not seeing things that disrupted their already scheduled morning. The underground station was a different matter. Harry watched Hagrid regard the underground turnstile with the expression of a man confronting something personally offensive. The turnstile was profoundly insufficient. Hagrid turned sideways. The turnstile remained unpersuaded. Hagrid's pink umbrella was involved in some kind of structural negotiation with the ceiling. It was the first time in 8 hours of impossible information that Harry felt anything close to laughter. The feeling was so unfamiliar, he stood with it for a moment, just to see what it was. They took the bus instead. The Leaky Cauldron was on a street Harry would not otherwise have noticed. A narrow place, squeezed between a bookshop and a record store, apparently invisible to every person who walked past it. Harry could see it with perfect clarity. He had apparently been able to see things like this his whole life, and had simply not had context for what he was seeing. He followed Hagrid through the door. The inside was dark and low-ceilinged, and smelled of old wood and something that might have been fire whiskey, and might have been long-absorbed magic, though Harry didn't yet have a word for what magic smelled like. Candles burned along the walls. A fire was going, despite the August morning. Behind the bar, a small man with no teeth and a welcoming expression, looked up at the sound of the door. "Hagrid," he said, with the warmth of long acquaintance. "The usual?" "Later, Tom. Got young Harry Potter with me today." The pub went quiet. It was not the aggressive quiet of a room that stops and stares. It was the particular quiet of a room that holds its breath. Harry stood in the doorway and felt it and did not know what to do with it, because there was no precedent in his experience for being recognized. He had spent his whole life being thoroughly, comprehensively unremarked upon, and the sensation of being known by people who did not know him was profoundly strange and somewhat alarming. They wanted to shake his hand. A wizened old man with a monocle. A young couple who couldn't quite speak and didn't need to. Harry shook hands and said it was nice to meet everyone, and meant none of it in particular. In the corner, a young man in a purple turban appeared to be having a conversation with himself, and startled badly when he noticed Harry standing nearby, then pumped Harry's hand with excessive enthusiasm before retreating to a corner to be nervous in private. Harry filed it away. What people wanted from a name. Then Hagrid tapped a sequence of bricks in the back wall, and everything else became temporarily irrelevant. The wall opened. Not slowly, not dramatically. It unfolded itself with the purposeful efficiency of something that simply was what it was, and on the other side of it was Diagon Alley, and Diagon Alley was busy and bright and smelled of animals, and something scorched, and something sweet, and Harry stood at the entrance and felt the world rearrange itself once more. Cauldrons were stacked 3 deep outside a shop on the left. Pewter, brass, copper, self-stirring. Cages of owls turned their heads to follow a cat walking past with profound aristocratic contempt. A broomstick hung suspended in a shop window, gleaming. 2 children Harry's age stood arguing in front of a display of trading cards, one of them waving a card with a dragon on it, the other refusing to be impressed. An ice cream parlor was just opening its striped awning, and the man inside waved at Hagrid like an old friend. "Florian Fortescue," Hagrid said. "Best ice cream in the alley. We'll stop on the way back." Harry looked at everything and let himself look, with attention and without attachment. He did not let himself think, "Mine." He let himself notice, which was different. Gringotts was at the end of the alley, white marble and towering, substantially taller than everything around it, in the way that things built to contain other people's money often were. 2 goblins stood at the bronze outer doors, short and dark-eyed, and watching the foot traffic with the specific expression of people who found it professionally adequate. The doors themselves were silver, and beyond them were gold. Harry could see the gold doors from here, and they were the most serious things he had seen in an alley full of serious things. Above the main entrance, carved into the marble, were several lines of verse. Harry read them. He read them slowly, the way he read anything he wanted to understand, rather than merely skim. The verse described what happened to those who sought treasure that was not theirs. It described this with a precision that struck him as belonging less to the genre of warning and more to the genre of record. "What does it mean?" he asked Hagrid. "If someone did try to take something from here that wasn't theirs?" Hagrid looked at the inscription and then at Harry. "Just a warning," he said. "Goblins like to be clear about that sort of thing. But their vaults are unbreakable, Harry. Safest place in the world." "Right," Harry said. He was not worried. He was noting it, the same way he noted the quality of silence when Hagrid went careful around certain questions, and the same way he noted the way the pub had held its breath at his name. He was noting everything. He had been doing it his whole life, and he had the sense, new and unverified but growing, that he had been preparing to need it. He followed Hagrid up the marble steps. The goblin at the desk gave them a cart. It was smaller than Harry had expected, and showed no interest in that. He climbed in beside Hagrid, which left a precise amount of room for one reasonably sized 11-year-old, and no room for uncertainty about whether this was a good idea. And then the cart moved, and the question became academic. The tunnels went deep. Harry gripped the front rail and watched torchlight shred past in orange streaks, the walls close enough to touch if he'd been willing to let go, which he was not. The cart took corners with no particular opinion on physics. Behind him, Hagrid had his eyes pressed shut and was making a sound that was not quite a moan but working toward one. The air smelled of stone and old metal and something older than both. Cool and still, the smell of things that had stopped needing the surface. The cart rattled to a stop. A door. The goblin touched it in several places in a practiced sequence, and then stood back. The vault opened with a sound like a held breath releasing, and beyond it, green smoke, first curling at the stone lip. Then the smoke cleared. Mounds of it. Gold galleons, silver sickles, bronze knots, heaped in the kind of quantity that Harry had no existing frame for. He stood at the threshold and looked at it, and felt something he couldn't immediately name. A first impression of dazzle, of sheer more than he had ever had in his life, which was not a difficult threshold to clear. He stood there another moment. The dazzle passed. He had spent 11 years counting change. He knew, in his body rather than his head, what a pot of money looked like when it was regularly drawn from. The gradual reduction, the flat surface, where there had been a peak. He had no basis for comparing this vault to what it should be, but something in the way the gold sat made him go still in a way that had nothing to do with being impressed. It was less than it should be. He didn't know why he was certain, only that he was. Hagrid had pulled out a small pouch and was beginning to fill it with a cheerful efficiency that suggested he had done this before. Harry watched him for a moment, and then he turned to the goblin, who had remained at the vault door with the precise stillness of someone whose professional discretion was a matter of institutional pride. "Is there a record?" Harry said quietly, "of how much was here when my parents died?" He had been turning the question over since the boat crossing, refining it, stripping it of anything that could be read as accusation rather than inquiry. The goblin looked at him. The look was not long, but it was thorough, in the way that things done by people who have been alive for a very long time tend to be thorough. "There is a record of every transaction made on this vault since its establishment," the goblin said. "Could I see it?" A pause, the gap between a question being considered and an answer delivered. Then the goblin produced a ledger. It was slim and brown and heavier than it looked. Harry opened it. The first entry was dated 1st November 1981. A deposit. The full estate of James and Lily Potter, logged into Vault 687 following the deaths of the primary account holders. A number followed that was substantial enough to make the current state of the vault legible in a new way, the way a single point of data makes a line visible. Harry read the original figure. He looked at the current figure. The distance between them was a decade. Then he read the withdrawals. They were organized by party. The ledger was not a narrative document. It did not explain itself or apologize for its contents. It was a record. Harry read it as a record. Party 1. A. Dumbledore. Multiple entries, irregular intervals, across all 10 years since November 1981. The amounts varied. Some were small, several were not small at all. The most recent entry was dated 4 months ago. Party 2, a ministry designation, a title rather than a name, an estate management function. Fewer entries than Party 1, clustered in the first 2 years, the amounts precise and bureaucratic. Party 3, Dursley household payments, quarterly entries, labelled, with the flat neutrality of goblin record-keeping as guardian compensation. Small amounts, regular. 11 years of them, each one representing a quarter of a year of Harry sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs. He read it twice. His face did what it had learned to do. Nothing. He stood in the entrance of Vault 687 and did not cry, because crying was not useful, and the numbers were already written down. What he felt was colder and more precise than crying. It required pen and paper and a very clear head. Hagrid had his pouch and was beaming at it. He looked up. "Ready, Harry? Got enough for your school things and then some, I reckon." Harry looked at the goblin. "May I have a copy of this page?" The goblin regarded him for a moment. Then, with the expression of someone who was professionally neutral on all matters, but was perhaps, in some very contained way, interested, he produced a copy of the ledger entry and held it out. Harry took it. He folded it carefully and put it in the envelope that still held his Hogwarts acceptance letter. Address. The floor, the hut on the rock, the sea, and tucked it inside his jacket. He turned back to Hagrid. "I'm ready to go," he said. "Good lad. All set? Let's get your wand, then." Harry said nothing more. The shop was narrow and dust-smelling, its window crammed with wand boxes, and when Harry pushed the door open, a bell rang, and the wand-maker appeared from between the shelves almost immediately, slight, with pale silver eyes, moving with the unhurried precision of a man for whom nothing was ever done quickly that didn't need to be. He looked at Harry with recognition, not the pub's breathless kind, but a quieter, more considered sort. "Harry Potter," he said. "Yes." The fitting took time. Boxes came down from the shelves in quick succession, and each wand Harry tried did nothing useful, or did something wrong, or produced a warmth that faded before it settled. The wand-maker watched each attempt with concentrated patience. Then, holly, phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple. Harry held it, and the warmth moved through him, not dramatically, but with the certainty of a key in the right lock. Sparks scattered from the tip. The wand-maker looked very satisfied. The warmth was real, even with the ledger folded in his jacket pocket, even with the numbers already sitting in his chest like a stone he intended to do something about. He felt it, and he filed it away under things that matter separately. He was going to need this wand. He was not going to let one thing crowd out everything else. He paid for it. The wand-maker told him to keep the box and to keep the receipt, and that he expected great things. Harry thanked him and left. The bookshop was busy. Harry went through the first-year list with method. Standard book of spells, a history of magic, magical drafts and potions, each one found and stacked. Then he went back along the shelves. The book he wanted was not on the list. It was a thin volume in pale green covers, spine faded, wedged between two histories. Wizarding Lore for the Non-Expert. 3rd edition. He pulled it out. The bookseller looked at him when he put it on the counter with the rest. Then he looked at the first-year list, and back at the book, and at Harry. Harry paid. He did not explain. The bookseller put it in the bag with everything else, and Harry carried the bag out into the alley and walked back to where Hagrid was waiting with a cone of ice cream from Florian Fortescue's, which he held out as Harry approached. Harry took it. He ate it. The ice cream was extraordinary, and the ledger was in his pocket, and both of these things were true at the same time. He had the rest of the day for the ice cream. He would need the evening for what came next. The room had a window. Harry noticed it immediately. Noticed it in the way he noticed things that were absent from his usual life, which was with a particular kind of attention, careful and slow, as though looking directly might cause it to stop being true. The window faced the alley. The glass was old and a little wavy, and the view it offered was of rooftops and a narrow strip of sky that had gone from gold to purple to the particular dark blue that came just before stars. He stood at it for a while. Just stood. Hagrid had fussed briefly, extra blankets, candles, a jug of water, and then stood in the doorway deciding if there was one more thing. Harry said the room was fine. Hagrid said he was going downstairs for a small drink. Just one, wouldn't be long. Harry said that was fine. The door closed, and Harry was alone. He sat on the bed. He didn't take out the ledger yet. He sat with the room first, with the fact of having one. A room with a door that locked from the inside, and a window and a bed he didn't have to share the space of with mops and old boxes. He was not going to let himself be too simple-minded about the fact that this felt enormous. It was simply the first room. There would be others. He took out the ledger copy and the books, and he set them on the bed, and he began. He started with a piece of parchment. The leaky cauldron had them at the desk. Harry had helped himself to 3 sheets before coming upstairs, and he wrote a name at the top of it. Albus Dumbledore. He set the quill down and looked at the name. He had known it for less than 24 hours. He had heard it first from Hagrid, then from people in the pub whose voices had changed when they said it, the way voices changed around names that meant something enormous and old. He had associated it with Hogwarts, Headmaster Albus Dumbledore, before he had associated it with anything else. Before the vault. He picked the quill back up and wrote, beneath the name, what he knew. Dumbledore had placed him with the Dursleys. Hagrid had said so, in the hut on the rock, in the phrasing of someone delivering information that was just background, just context. Dumbledore left you with the only family you have. Harry wrote it down. He wrote it as a fact rather than a thing to feel about, because right now he needed the facts in order, not the feelings, which were there but were not useful yet. Dumbledore had held the key to Vault 687 before Harry ever arrived at Gringotts. The goblin had not said this directly, but it was in the ledger. 10 years of withdrawals signed by A. Dumbledore, and the vault key had come to Hagrid from somewhere, from someone who had been managing Harry's affairs in his absence, and there was only one name that appeared on a decade of ledger entries, and also signed the letters that arrived addressed to cupboards under stairs. Harry calculated the sum from the ledger entries. He was not quick at arithmetic. The Dursleys had not invested in his education, beyond what was required, but he was careful, and careful was enough. He wrote the total at the bottom of the column. He looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote it again, beneath the first total, to make sure he hadn't misread his own writing. The number was not what made him go still. What made him go still was the structure of it, the regular intervals, the 10 years of it, the fact that someone had been making decisions about his parents' money for as long as he had been alive, and no one had said, "Here is what they left. Here is what it has been used for. Here is the accounting." He drew a line and began the second section. The ministry entry was a title rather than a name, something in the Department of Magical Administration, an estate management designation. Harry wrote it down. He looked at it. He did not know this person's name. He did not have any living memory of a ministry official appearing at Privet Drive to explain his situation, to tell him he had a guardian, or a vault, or a place in a world he didn't know existed. He put a question mark beside the entry. He would need to find out. That was something for a different letter. He drew a second line. The Dursleys. He put the quill down again. He looked at the ledger entry. Guardian compensation. Quarterly. Regular. The label had the blankness of bureaucratic language. Compensation implied exchange, implied a service rendered, implied that someone had calculated what Harry's presence in that house was worth, and had paid accordingly. He thought about his cupboard under the stairs. He thought about it with the specific precision of someone who had spent a lot of time in it, who knew the dimensions of it, who knew the way the sound of the house changed at different times of night. Dudley's footsteps overhead, the particular creak of the third step, Uncle Vernon's cough in the kitchen before bed. He thought about the 2 bedrooms Dudley had, about the birthday cakes Aunt Petunia baked every year, which were for Dudley and not for him, about the Christmases and the school uniforms that were Dudley's cast-offs, and the meals and the careful rationing of heat and attention. Someone had paid the Dursleys to house him. Whatever that payment had been, it had not gone toward him. He was not going to cry about this either. He had not cried about the vault, and he was not going to cry about the Dursleys, because there was a letter to write, and crying was a thing for after the letter, if at all. He wrote their names. Phi, Dursley and P. Dursley, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He wrote the quarterly figure from the ledger beside them. He sat with the parchment, and then he opened Wizarding Law for the Non-Expert. Knew enough to still resist the spine, and found the section he had been turning over since the boat crossing. Blood protection. The principle was described in clear, dry language. A sacrificial magical charm anchored to a shared bloodline, providing protection as long as the protected individual lived within a blood relative's home of the charm's creator. He understood it as a mechanism and as a reason for Privet Drive, a reason for the cupboard, a reason for 10 years of that specific arrangement. He was alive on the available evidence, which was at least partly attributable to it. He was not going to pretend otherwise. He thought about whether to acknowledge the blood protection in the letter. It would be dishonest not to. He was not writing a dishonest letter. He turned back to the parchment and added a note, carefully, below the Dursley entry. I understand that a blood protection charm has been anchored to my mother's surviving relative's household for my safety, and I do not dispute that this protection is real or that it may have been necessary. I dispute the use of my parents' estate to fund a compensation arrangement for this household without my knowledge, oversight, or consent, and without any corresponding guarantee that the funds went toward the welfare of the person they were ostensibly there to protect. He read the sentence back. It was accurate. It was not more or less than accurate. By 3 a.m, the room was cold, and the candle had burned down to a stub, and the letter was done. 3 names, 3 figures, a formal statement of withdrawal from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, effective immediately, pending a full accounting of Vault 687 and the sealing of that vault to further withdrawals. The ledger copy was folded and attached. The demand for accounting was itemized. Harry read it through once from the beginning. Then he folded it. He was not angry, exactly. He was something that had the temperature of anger and the shape of precision, a very sharp instrument, requiring careful handling. The window still showed stars. Somewhere below him, Hagrid was almost certainly still at the bar. Harry lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and held the letter against his chest and did not sleep for a very long time. The sky went grey before it went anything else. Harry watched it from the writing desk, watched the dark thin out, the stars go one by one, the rooftops of the alley resolve out of nothing into shapes. He had not slept. He had lain on the bed for a while with the letter against his chest, and then he had not been able to stay horizontal any longer, and had sat at the desk instead, and that was where the night had found him, and where the morning was finding him now. The letter was in his hands. He was not reading it again. He had read it enough times to have it in order, and reading it again would be a form of second-guessing, which he had decided against. He was giving himself a moment, which was different, A moment before it was irreversible was not the same as a moment to reconsider. It was more like standing at the edge of something and looking at the distance. Not because you weren't going to jump, but because you were, and some things deserved to be looked at before they happened. The light shifted from grey to the faint gold grey that came just before the sun. The alley below was empty. A cat crossed from one side to the other with enormous purpose and disappeared into a doorway. Somewhere behind the rooftops, London was waking up, the great flat sound of it beginning, traffic, and the distant sound of something mechanical, and then a bird, one bird, somewhere in the grey. Harry stood up. He carried the letter downstairs. The pub was empty except for the man behind the bar. Tom, who had the specific wakefulness of someone for whom the morning was not early, but simply a different part of the job, and who looked at Harry when he came down the stairs with the incurious acceptance of a person who had spent a career seeing all kinds of things come and go through his establishment. "Can I send a letter?" Harry asked. "I was told there was an owl." Tom produced one from a perch behind the bar, an elderly bird with dusty brown feathers and the expression of someone recently and unexpectedly woken, which it was. It blinked at Harry with slow professional tolerance. Harry addressed the envelope carefully. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Office of the Headmaster. He had the address from his acceptance letter, the one that said, "The floor, the hut on the rock, the sea," which he would find funny later, perhaps, but not today. He tied the envelope to the owl's leg. The owl regarded the weight of it with resigned dignity. "Thank you," Harry said to the owl. He wasn't sure if owls appreciated being thanked, but it seemed rude not to. He carried the owl to the window behind the bar. Tom opened it without being asked. The owl stepped off Harry's arm, caught the air, and was gone. A brown shape pulling upward into the pale morning sky, crossing the stripe of light between the rooftops, and then smaller, and then not there. Harry stood at the window until it was not there. Then he turned around. "Breakfast," said Tom. "Please," Harry said. He ate toast and drank tea and listened to the city outside. The leaky cauldron existed in a particular relationship with sound, muffled somehow, as though the building held a slightly different layer of quiet than the street beyond its walls. Harry sat in this quiet and ate methodically and watched the light on the bar's surface change as the morning came in from the direction of the window, and he thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of particular achievement. The letter was sent. The thinking about it was over. What came next would require a different kind of thinking, and that could wait until something came next. Tom did not ask questions. Harry appreciated this. He was on his second cup of tea when Hagrid came downstairs. He heard him first, the stair that couldn't accommodate Hagrid without registering it, the particular complaint of wood that had been built for ordinary people and was being asked to accommodate something much more substantial. Then Hagrid appeared in the entrance to the pub, already dressed, his hair pushed back vaguely in the direction of orderly, looking at Harry with the expression of a man who had slept on something troubling and woken up to find it still there. He crossed the room and lowered himself into the chair across from Harry, which was the correct chair for the table, but substantially the wrong chair for Hagrid, being perhaps 2/3 of what the occasion required. He looked at Harry. Then he looked at the table, at the breakfast things, toast rack, teapot, a small pot of marmalade, at the empty space on the bar where the owl had been. The owl perch. He looked at the owl perch for a long time. Then he looked at Harry again. "Harry," Hagrid said. His voice was doing something complicated. "What did you do?" Harry set his teacup down. "I sent a letter," he said. "To Hogwarts, to the headmaster's office." Hagrid's hands, large enough that each one was a reasonable substitute for a dinner plate, came up and set themselves flat on the table. He looked at them as though checking they were still there. "A letter," he said. "3 names," Harry said. "The ledger figures next to each one. A formal withdrawal from Hogwarts enrollment, effective immediately. A demand for a full accounting, and a request that the vault be sealed to new withdrawals while the accounting is completed." He paused. I included a copy of the ledger page. There was a silence. Outside, London went about its morning with no particular awareness of what had just happened inside one unremarkable pub. "Harry," Hagrid said very carefully. "Dumbledore, he's not. What he did, it's—" He stopped. He tried again. "It's complicated, is what it is." "I know it's complicated," Harry said. "That's why I explained it in the letter. I didn't just write, 'You took my money.' I wrote the figures. I wrote the timeline. I wrote the specific entries from the ledger and what they represent. I also wrote that I understand the blood protection charm exists, and that I'm not disputing that it was necessary." He looked at Hagrid. "I disputed the method of funding it, without telling me." Hagrid had his hands flat on the table still. He was looking at them. "I'm not saying he's a bad man," Harry said, because he felt it was important to say that, because he believed it, or at least believed it was possible, which was not the same thing but was honest. "I'm saying he made decisions about my life and my parents' money without asking me, and I would like that acknowledged and addressed." He picked up his teacup again. "That seems like a reasonable thing to want." Hagrid did not say that Dumbledore had done nothing wrong. He opened his mouth. Something passed across his face. A struggle, brief but visible, between the loyalty that had been Hagrid's defining characteristic for as long as Harry had known him, which was one day, and something else, something that couldn't quite call the situation defensible when laid out this plainly. His mouth closed. He looked at the table again. The silence where that defense would have been said was long enough to constitute its own kind of statement. Harry heard it. He had been listening to Hagrid's silences since the hut on the rock, and he had a reasonable taxonomy of them by now. This one, heavy, uncomfortable, not arguing with anything Harry had said, meant something specific. It meant that if Dumbledore had done nothing wrong, Hagrid would have said so. And he hadn't said so. "He'll write back," Hagrid said at last. His voice was quieter than it had been. "Or he'll come himself. You know that." "Good," Harry said. "I want him to." Hagrid looked at him for a long moment, and then he looked away, and he picked up the teapot and poured himself the last of the tea into a mug that was barely sufficient, and held it in both hands, and stared at it. And Harry let him. Somewhere above the city, moving north and west with the unhurried purpose of a well-directed owl, the letter was still travelling. In a few hours it would reach the Scottish mountains, the glens, the particular quality of light that belonged to a very large, very old castle that was not entirely in the same layer of the world as the places around it. In a few hours, perhaps at the moment when the sun was fully up and the shadows of the battlements were long across the courtyard stone, the owl would reach the high window of the headmaster's office and would tap, once, on the glass. The instruments on the shelves would make their soft sounds. The light would fall on the desk. The owl would tap again. The first-year enrollment lists arrived every June, generated by the Hogwarts quill that recorded magical births, and Minerva McGonagall had been studying hers since it came. She was in her office, spare, orderly, the kind of room that looked like its occupant and made no apologies for it. The castle around her was summer quiet, a different quality of silence from the term-time kind. No students in the corridors, no distant crashes from the direction of the defense classroom, no noise from the grounds, except the occasional sound of Hagrid doing something that probably had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The enchanted ceiling of the great hall 3 floors down would be showing clear sky and dust motes. The portraits dozed. McGonagall sat at her desk with the enrollment list and reviewed it with the attention she gave to anything that would matter in September. Harry Potter was at the top of the G through P sheet. She had been looking at his name since June. It appeared the same as all the others: ink, quill work, the particular neat hand of the registration charm. But it was not the same as all the others, and she had not been able to look at it without feeling something that she had not yet named. It was not guilt, exactly. It was not grief. It was something in the vicinity of both that she had chosen, so far not to examine too closely. She was still looking at it when the owl arrived at the headmaster's window. She did not see this happen. She felt it in the way that people who have lived in a building long enough develop an awareness of its sounds. The shift in the castle's ambient quality. A door somewhere above her. Footsteps that had the particular deliberateness of someone sitting down at a desk. She set down her quill and straightened the list and waited, without knowing what she was waiting for. Albus Dumbledore read the letter once. He read it at his desk with the morning light coming in sideways, and the silver instruments on the shelves doing their soft work around him, spinning and measuring and emitting their small sounds, the sounds of a room full of things that watched and monitored and reported. He read the letter from the beginning to the end without stopping. Then he set it on the desk in front of him. He sat very still. The instruments kept their sounds. He did not notice them. He was looking at the letter, at the handwriting first, which was a child's handwriting, careful and slightly angular, and nothing like James Potter's or Lily Evans's, and so presumably a thing Harry had arrived at himself. Then at the contents. 3 names, the ledger figures, a formal statement, numbered, each point distinct from the others, an attached copy of the withdrawal records. He read it again. The second reading was not a re-reading, it was something else. The reading that happened when the first reading had been about processing, and the second was about understanding what had been processed. He had been in the position, many times in a long life, of receiving information that changed the shape of things. He was familiar with the experience. He did not find it pleasant, and he did not pretend to. He touched the ledger copy. The numbers were Gringotts numbers, which meant they were exact, which meant there was nothing in them to dispute. He looked at the line about the blood protection, the acknowledgement of it, the explicit statement that the complaint was not about the protection itself, but about the funding and the lack of disclosure. He read this line 3 times. Then he set the letter down again and called for McGonagall. She arrived in less than 2 minutes, coming in with the brisk composure of someone who had been waiting for a summons she hadn't known she was expecting. Dumbledore held the letter out to her without preamble. Her face, as she read, went through several things in the space of a few seconds. Surprise was first, genuine surprise, the kind that sat on her features without having had time to compose itself into something more useful. Then something harder to name, a particular quality of stillness that was not calm. She read to the bottom. She read the acknowledgement of the blood protection and the line about funding without consent, and her face did the thing it did when she was making a calculation she did not want to make, but was too honest to avoid. She gave the letter back. "What do we do?" she said. "Not. This is wrong. Not. He couldn't possibly have. Or perhaps it's a misunderstanding, or the records are mistaken, or an 11-year-old cannot have produced something this coherent." She said, "What do we do?" The question was, in its way, more damning than any argument would have been, because it accepted the premise without argument. They were both aware of this. They said nothing about it. "I need to speak with Hagrid first," Dumbledore said. McGonagall nodded. She set the letter on his desk. She left, and the door closed behind her with a quietness that had nothing to do with approval, and nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the specific discipline of a woman who would not say, in that moment, what she actually thought, not because she didn't think it, but because thinking it and saying it were two different things, and only one of them could be taken back. Severus Snape heard about the letter from McGonagall. She found him in the staff corridor in the early afternoon, carrying something toward the dungeon stairs, and she told him with the economy of a woman who had been composing the summary in her head since leaving the headmaster's office. Snape listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing immediately. He went down to his potions store and began an inventory. He inventoried the store when he needed to think in a way that didn't show on his face. It was a long room, and the shelves were numerous, and the work required just enough attention to prevent brooding, and not enough to prevent thought, which made it useful. He worked his way along the first shelf, salamander blood, lacewing flies, jobberknoll feathers, bicorn horn, and thought about what McGonagall had told him. He was not surprised that there had been withdrawals. He had spent years not thinking about what Dumbledore managed and how. He had concentrated, instead, on what was necessary to concentrate on: his work, his debts, the quiet, ongoing project of making himself useful enough not to be discarded. It had left him no space for questions that were not his business. What surprised him was the precision. A withdrawal ledger. 3 named parties. An acknowledged blood protection charm with a specific objection to the funding mechanism, distinct from the protection itself. A formal withdrawal of enrollment attached, not as a threat, but as a demonstration of agency. He reached the end of the first shelf and started the second. Boomslang skin, fluxweed, dried nettles, and thought about the handwriting McGonagall had described. A child's hand, she'd said. Careful. He thought, Lily's son. He had said this to himself before, in different contexts, and it had always meant different things. Now it meant something specific. It meant that whatever he had been expecting, over the years, from the boy who would eventually arrive at Hogwarts, overwhelmed, dazzled, grateful, easy, this was not going to be that. He did not know whether that was better or worse. He went back to the inventory. Dumbledore drafted a response that evening. He wrote 3 different openings. He crossed them out. He wrote a fuller version. Careful, explanatory, the kind of letter that addressed each point in order and offered what he could offer by way of accounting. He read it back from the beginning. Then he set it aside. It was not dishonest, but it was also not what the situation required, and he had a habit, long practiced, of being able to tell the difference between those two things. He looked at the Gringotts ledger copy for a long time. The numbers were correct. They had always been correct. He had not lied about the numbers, because the numbers had never been the issue. The issue was the absence of a conversation that would have required him to have information he was not prepared to give to a child of 1 or 2 or 5 or 10. And then it had been 11 years and the conversation was still not had, and a letter had arrived from a hut in the North Sea that made the absence of it very clearly visible. He took out a second piece of parchment. He wrote, Hagrid, come to Hogwarts. He folded it. He sealed it. He looked at Fawkes, who was on his perch across the room, watching him with the particular attention of a creature that has a very long memory. Fawkes did not offer an opinion. Dumbledore did not ask for one. He held the note for a moment, and then he gave it to the Phoenix to carry, and the bird went, and the headmaster's office was quiet again, with its soft, instrumental sounds, and the first response he had drafted sat folded in the desk drawer, and the evening came. Hagrid came back the next morning looking older. Not dramatically older. Not in a way that would be visible to someone who hadn't spent the last 2 days studying his face with the attention Harry had given to the only adult he was currently in close proximity to. But his eyes were heavier, and the set of his shoulders had something in it that hadn't been there before he went to Hogwarts, and he sat down across from Harry at the pub table and picked up the menu and studied it with the focus of a man who was very carefully not saying something. Harry let him be. He had ordered porridge before Hagrid arrived and was eating it without particular urgency, and he watched Hagrid look at the menu and decide between 3 things and eventually flag down the bar for all 3. And he waited. He had learned, at some point in his life, he couldn't have said exactly when, but it had been early, that waiting for someone to arrive at the thing they meant to say was often faster than asking them to arrive at it. Asking made people defensive. Waiting made them arrive on their own terms, which was usually more useful. They ate. Hagrid consumed a quantity of food that would have seen Harry through a week and said things about the weather and the state of the alley, and whether the porridge here was better than what you got at the 3 Broomsticks, which was a pub in Hogsmeade that Harry hadn't been to, and Harry responded to each of these things with the minimal necessary engagement, and waited. It was over the 2nd pot of tea that Harry decided the waiting had run its course. "You came on Sirius Black's motorbike," Harry said. "You mentioned it in the hut. And you said he was my parents' best friend. You said he would have been my guardian, if things had gone differently." He looked at Hagrid across the table. "What happened to him?" Hagrid set down his mug. He had the expression of a man who had known this was coming, and had spent the morning hoping it wouldn't. "Sirius," he said, and stopped. "Sirius," Harry agreed. Hagrid looked at the table. He looked at his tea. He picked the mug back up, seemed to decide this was too small a defense against the conversation, and set it down again. "He was your parents' best friend, right?" Hagrid said slowly. "Him and James, they were. They were close. Closer than brothers, some people said. And he was supposed to be your guardian, if anything ever happened to James and Lily. Godfather. Everyone knew it." His voice had gone quieter. "But then, the night it all happened, Sirius went after another one of their old friends, Peter Pettigrew. There was a confrontation on a street in London. Peter was, well, he was killed, or that's what everyone thought. And 12 muggles died, and Sirius was there, and they took him in. They arrested him," Harry said. "Yeah. He'd betrayed them, see, Harry. Sirius was the one who told you-know-who where your parents were hiding. That's what everyone said. He was the one he gave 'em up." Hagrid's voice was rough with it. "It was the worst time. The whole wizarding world was. After you-know-who fell, there were days of chaos. People didn't know what was happening. Death Eaters being caught everywhere. Sirius being brought in. It all happened very fast." Harry listened to this. He listened carefully, and he turned it over. And he did not dispute it. He had no basis to dispute it. But there was a question sitting inside it that wanted asking. "Was there a trial?" he said. Hagrid went quiet. It was the quiet that Harry had learned to recognize in the days since the hut on the rock, the specific quality of it, the weight. It was not the quiet of someone trying to remember. It was not the quiet of someone who was about to say yes. There was, "Here is when it was," and what the verdict was. It had a different texture from both of those. It was the quiet of someone who couldn't answer yes, and had decided that not answering was preferable to saying anything else. Harry watched Hagrid's face, and understood this, and felt something in his chest go very precise, and very cold. "There wasn't a trial, was there?" he said. It was not a question. Hagrid looked at him. The look had something helpless in it. "Harry, things were very difficult after everything that happened. The war was just... people were just trying to..." "That's not the same as yes," Harry said. The words came out quiet. He hadn't intended them to be gentle, but he hadn't intended them to be cruel either. They were just accurate. Hagrid saying that things had been difficult was a real thing. He believed it. Harry believed it. But it was not the same as saying that a trial had happened. Two things could be true at once. The times could have been difficult, and there could still have been a trial, if one had been held. If one had not been held, the difficulty of the times did not change that fact. It was a separate fact. "You keep going quiet," Harry said, "when I ask things that ought to have easy answers. If Sirius was convicted, there would be a record of it. A trial, a verdict, a date, a judge. Is there one?" Hagrid was looking at his tea again. Harry, I don't know all the details of how it was done." "That's also not the same as yes." Another silence. Hagrid's enormous hands were around the mug, and the mug looked very small inside them, and Harry thought, not for the first time, about what it must cost Hagrid to be having this conversation, to be asked things he couldn't truthfully answer in Dumbledore's defense, and to be too honest to answer them the other way. He wasn't a man who could lie when asked directly. It was something Harry liked about him. It was also, right now, very clarifying. "Could you bring me some parchment?" Harry said. Hagrid looked up. "What for?" "I need to write another letter." Harry looked at him steadily. "To the Ministry of Magic. 2 questions. First, was Sirius Black tried and convicted by the Wizengamot for the crimes he was imprisoned for? And if so, on what date and under whose authority? Second, following the imprisonment of my designated guardian, who was legally appointed as my wizarding guardian, and under what authority was that appointment made?" Hagrid stared at him for a long moment. "Harry," he said carefully, "I don't know if that's... if you should." "I'm not asking Dumbledore," Harry said. "I'm asking the Ministry. They're different institutions. The Ministry keeps legal records. That's what ministries do." "Yeah, but if there was a trial," Harry said, "they'll say so, and I'll have my answer. If there wasn't," he stopped, "then I'll also have my answer. Either way, it's information, and right now I don't have it." Hagrid sat with this. He sat with it for a full minute, which was a long time at a pub breakfast table, and Harry ate the last of his porridge, and waited. And outside the alley was beginning its morning business, footsteps on the cobbles, the sound of a shop being unlocked, an owl going somewhere with purpose. "Right," Hagrid said at last. He got up. He went to the bar and asked Tom for parchment and a quill, and Tom produced both without commentary, and Hagrid brought them back to the table and set them in front of Harry and sat back down. Harry uncapped the ink. He wrote the date at the top, 3rd August 1991, because it was after midnight and therefore the next day, and then the address, and then the 2 questions, set out in numbered order. Hagrid watched him write. He sat across the table with his tea, and he watched Harry's hand move across the parchment, and his expression was the expression of a man watching something he had no capacity to stop, and was not entirely certain he should stop, and was deeply, genuinely afraid of both of those possibilities at once. He did not say anything. There was nothing left for him to say that was honest, and also any kind of obstacle. He had tried the obstacles. Harry had walked through them. The quill moved. The letter took shape. Outside, somewhere above the alley, a bird was singing in the August morning, like the day was going to be uncomplicated, and neither of them said anything at all. The letter to the Ministry went separately from everything else. Harry had thought carefully about this. He had two complaints running now, the vault and the absence of a trial, and he was going to keep them separate. Individual facts were harder to deflect than patterns. A pattern could be called circumstantial. A specific question about a specific legal record was harder to wave away. He addressed the ministry letter to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He did not include his Hogwarts withdrawal. He sealed it and sent it with the pub owl, who was becoming a familiar presence, and then he went back to his room and read for 3 hours before coming downstairs to order porridge. The waiting took 6 days. Harry spent them reading the first-year textbooks, the Wizarding Law book, working through them in order at the corner table that had become, through sheer repetition, something like his table. He ordered porridge for breakfast, and the cheapest thing on the dinner menu, not from need, but from 11 years of habit that didn't consult his current circumstances before ordering. He was aware of this and thought he should address it eventually. He ordered porridge again the next morning. The books were interesting. The textbooks were sometimes odd and sometimes illuminating, and once or twice downright alarming. But they were the kind of interesting that kept his mind occupied during the parts of the day when he didn't want his mind wandering into the territory of things he couldn't yet act on. He was learning that waiting had a technique to it, and the technique involved keeping enough of your attention engaged that the rest of it didn't spiral. Hagrid stayed. He had weighed whatever instructions he'd received against leaving an 11-year-old alone in a pub in Diagon Alley, and come down on the side of staying. He read the newspaper at breakfast with the concentration of a man for whom newspapers presented a meaningful challenge, and asked periodically how the books were going. Harry told him. It was, in its way, companionable. The ministry's first letter arrived on the 4th day. It was marked with an official seal, a large purple wax circle with an embossed ministry insignia. And the text inside was brief and impeccable in its vagueness. His inquiry had been received. The matter was under review by the relevant department. He would be contacted in due course with further information. Harry read this 3 times, looking for what it didn't say as much as what it did. It did not say, yes, there was a trial. It said, under review, which was the language of an institution that had received a question it would prefer not to answer directly. He added it to the locked envelope at the bottom of his trunk where the other letters lived. The ministry representative arrived on the 7th day. He came in the early afternoon and stood at the door for a moment before finding Harry at the corner table. He was a compact man in formal ministry robes, carefully pressed, holding a leather folio, with the ease of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. He had arrived expecting something manageable. He had not expected this particular 11-year-old. It was visible in the brief recalibration of his expression as he crossed the room. He had perhaps expected Harry at the Dursleys' address in Surrey, not sitting very straight at a pub table with an open book and the specific quality of stillness that came from 6 days of waiting. He introduced himself with a title from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He sat down. He opened his folio and placed his hands on the table in the manner of someone about to deliver a carefully prepared reassurance. "Mr. Potter," he said, "I want to begin by thanking you for bringing your inquiry to our attention. The matter of Sirius Black's case is one the department takes seriously, and I can assure you that—" "Was there a trial?" Harry said. The ministry official paused. "The department's review is currently—" "That wasn't my question," Harry said. "My question was whether Sirius Black was tried and convicted by the Wizengamot for the crimes for which he was imprisoned. Was there a trial?" The official looked at him. He looked at his folio. He said, "The circumstances of the 1981 case involved an extraordinarily difficult period in wizarding history, and the procedures of that time were—" "That's also not an answer to my question," Harry said. He said it pleasantly, without edge, which he had found was more effective than saying it any other way. "I'll try the second one. If there was no trial, hypothetically, who would have authorized the imprisonment?" There was a silence of a different quality from the ones Harry had been collecting in the past week. This one had something in it that was not quite discomfort, but was in the same neighborhood. Ministerial authority can, in cases of extraordinary— "Who was appointed as my wizarding guardian?" Harry said, "following the imprisonment of my designated guardian, Sirius Black. That's my third question. I've been asking 2 versions of it and not receiving an answer, so I thought I'd ask the third one, which is related." The official's hands moved very slightly on his folio. "The guardianship arrangements for protected individuals are— The person," Harry said, "who was appointed as my guardian, or who took on a guardian's functions in the absence of a formal appointment. Do you know that their name appears in my Gringotts Vault withdrawal records for the past decade?" The ministry official went very still. It was a particular kind of stillness, not the stillness of someone who had nothing to say, but the stillness of someone who had understood, in the space between one sentence and the next, that they were in a considerably more complex situation than they had walked into. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him, with the polite attention of someone who had asked a question and was genuinely interested in the answer. The official said that he would need to refer certain aspects of the inquiry to additional departments. He said that the department took the welfare of all wizarding minors very seriously. He said that Harry would be hearing from them shortly with further information, and he said it in the tone of someone who was going to be having several urgent conversations before the end of the day. He stood. He shook Harry's hand, which Harry shook in return without standing up. He left, walking back through the pub with the pace of a man who had somewhere to be very soon. Harry watched him go, and then picked up his tea, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. "That went well," Hagrid said from the end of the table, where he had been sitting very quietly since the man arrived, and making a creditable effort to be invisible, which was not his natural state. "He's going to write a report," Harry said. "Tonight, probably. To whoever is above him." "Yeah," Hagrid said. "And then that person'll write one to the person above them. And eventually it'll reach someone who has to decide what to do about it," Harry said. Hagrid looked at him. The expression was complicated, something between concern and a kind of reluctant admiration, neither of which he seemed to have words for. He chose, in the end, to drink his tea instead. The report went up the chain, as reports do, with a speed that was in direct proportion to how urgently the person writing it wanted the responsibility for it to belong to someone else. It passed through 2 desks before it reached the right one. The right desk belonged to the Minister for Magic, who had held the position for just over a year, and who read the report twice and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had inherited something from his predecessor that he would very much have preferred not to inherit. A case with no trial record. A vault complaint involving Dumbledore. An 11-year-old in a pub asking questions with very clean answers that everyone currently alive would prefer not to give. He called for his senior aide. At Hogwarts, a message arrived from the ministry. Dumbledore read it at his desk and set it down beside the letter from Harry, which had been there for 6 days. Outside, the Scottish sky was doing what it did in August, long summer light turning gold before dark. Fawkes was on his perch across the room, watching with the patience of something very old. Fawkes did not sing tonight. Some evenings he did, and it helped. Tonight the silence was what there was. Dumbledore straightened the papers on his desk, the ministry message, the withdrawal letter, the Gringotts ledger copy, and arranged them in a row and looked at them. The evidence of one very productive week. He closed his hands on the edge of the desk and was quiet while the light in the office shifted toward evening, and the black case moved, whether he was ready for it or not. Dumbledore arrived on the afternoon of the 14th day. Harry was not surprised. He had been waiting, not anxiously, not impatiently, but in the deliberate way he had been practicing since the vault, the way that kept his attention where it was useful and didn't let the anticipation become noise. He had a book open on the table and his notes folded in his jacket pocket and a cup of tea at his elbow. And when Tom came to the back room to say there was someone asking after him, Harry put a marker in the book and stood up. He had heard Dumbledore described, very tall, accurate, long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, a nose that had been broken at some point in its long history. All accurate. What description hadn't conveyed was the quality of his presence, old enough to look ancient, and yet moving through the doorway with an ease that belonged to someone who had not yet considered the possibility of limitation. Harry made himself look directly at him. He had decided he was going to do that. "Harry," Dumbledore said. His voice was exactly what Harry had imagined, quiet, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. "Thank you for seeing me. I was expecting you," Harry said. There was a brief pause. Not awkward, just exact. Dumbledore's eyes moved to the back of the closed door and then back to Harry. "Hagrid is outside," Harry said. "He won't go further than that." Dumbledore looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. Not surprise exactly, but perhaps the recalibration of an expectation. He had noted that Harry had arranged Hagrid's position rather than the other way around. Harry was fine with him noting that. They sat across from each other at the small table. Harry took out his parchment and a quill and set them beside the tea. Dumbledore looked at the parchment. He said nothing about it. "I'll explain fully," Dumbledore said, "if you will allow me." "That's why I'm here," Harry said. Dumbledore folded his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment, not gathering himself, Harry thought, but choosing where to start, which was different. "When your parents died," Dumbledore said, "you were 15 months old. There was no legal mechanism that was going to move quickly enough to protect you. The magical world was in chaos. There were Death Eaters still at large, dark sympathizers, people who would have found an 11-month-old child of interest as a political symbol or a target. I made decisions quickly in a situation that did not allow for consultation. You put me with the Dursleys," Harry said. "I did. Your mother's sister. The only blood relative who could anchor the protection your mother's death had created." He paused. "That protection is not a small thing, Harry. It is the reason you have reached 11 years old in reasonable health, despite the ongoing interest of forces that would prefer you had not." "I understand the protection," Harry said. "I said so in the letter." "You did. Clearly." Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "The vault. The funds I used came from Vault 687. Some went to the Dursley household, not a large sum, quarterly, which was agreed upon as compensation for maintaining the conditions of the charm. I understand what you will say about whether that compensation reached you in any form." "It didn't," Harry said. "No," Dumbledore said. "I know. I will be honest with you, Harry, because I have decided that partial honesty will serve neither of us. I had a belief that the details of your financial situation were secondary to the situation of your survival. I believed that. I was not lying when I believed it. I am aware now that believing something does not make it a sufficient justification. Some of the money went elsewhere, Harry said. The ledger shows other entries under your name, not Dursley payments. The Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore said. My organization during the war. Expenses. Debts to settle as it wound down. I used some of what was in the vault, more than I had a straightforward right to use. Harry wrote, Order of the Phoenix, on his parchment. He would come back to it. You took my parents' money, Harry said, without asking me. You were an infant. For 10 years, Harry said. I was 11 years old last week, and I have been an infant for 10 years. Dumbledore did not answer immediately. The silence was not defensive. It was the silence of a man absorbing something he already knew, but was hearing said plainly for the first time, in those exact words, in that exact order, and finding that it landed differently than it had in his own head. There is something else I should tell you, Dumbledore said, that concerns the question of why all of this was felt to be so urgent. Harry looked up from the parchment. Before you were born, Dumbledore said, a prophecy was made about a child who would have the power to vanquish the dark wizard who killed your parents. The prophecy named you, named the conditions of your birth, and the dark wizard heard part of it and chose to act. That is why he came to Godric's Hollow. That is why your parents died. The room was very quiet. The words, Dumbledore said, are these. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month, dies. He stopped. He had stopped in the middle of the sentence. Harry noted the stopping. There's more, Harry said. Yes. You're not telling me all of it. Not tonight, Dumbledore said. I am telling you more than I have told anyone of your age, Harry. I am telling you that you exist in a story that was written before you were born, that you did not choose, and cannot entirely escape. And that is the true reason the Dursleys' house was not optional. The blood protection is not a courtesy. It is the most important magical safeguard you have against a threat that is not finished. Harry wrote, Prophecy, first half only. July. Thrice defied. Stopped mid-sentence. You're telling me, Harry said, that I can't leave the magical world because of a prophecy I didn't choose. I am telling you why the choices were made. I didn't ask for the reason, Harry said. I asked for the truth. Those aren't always the same. Another silence. Dumbledore looked at the parchment, and then at Harry, and his expression did something that Harry couldn't entirely read. There is also the matter of Sirius Black, Dumbledore said. There is, Harry said. I want him tried. If he's guilty, I'll have the answer I need. If he's not, he paused. If he's not guilty, I want my guardian. Dumbledore's face changed. It was the first time Harry had seen something genuinely move there. Not the careful honesty of the accounting, not the measured calculation of what to disclose. Something that moved, briefly, underneath the control. It was not grief, and it was not guilt, and it was not quite either. But it was in the territory of both, and it was real. I cannot make promises about the outcome of a legal review, Dumbledore said. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you not to obstruct it. I will not obstruct it. Good, Harry said. I'll take that as a provisional answer. He looked down at the parchment. He had been writing throughout. Not shorthand, not abbreviations, full sentences, a running record of the conversation from the beginning. He held it up so Dumbledore could see. Dumbledore looked at the parchment for a long moment. You are very like your mother, he said. Harry lowered the parchment. I thought I was like my father. You have James's face, Dumbledore said. You have Lily's mind. He said it the way someone said a thing they had been holding for a long time, and the holding had made it specific. Harry looked at him, and for a moment he didn't write anything at all. Dumbledore stood. He extended his hand, and Harry shook it. Then Dumbledore went to the door, and Harry heard Hagrid in the corridor, making a sound that was not quite relief, and then Dumbledore's voice low to him, and then footsteps going away. Harry sat in the back room, alone for a while. He looked at the last line of his notes. James's face. Lily's mind. Which he had written down even though it was not a negotiation point. He had written it because it was the truest thing Dumbledore had said, and he hadn't been ready to lose it. He folded the parchment and put it in the locked envelope and went out to the pub. Hagrid was at the table. In front of him were 2 cups of tea, one that was clearly his, being enormous, and one regular-sized one that he had already placed on Harry's side of the table before Harry sat down. He hadn't asked. He had just known. Harry sat down. He picked up the cup. They drank without speaking, and the August evening settled around them, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was the right thing. The letter from the ministry arrived on a Tuesday morning, marked with the official seal and addressed in the crisp hand of institutional correspondence. Harry read it twice at the breakfast table, while Hagrid watched from across the teapot. A Wizengamot panel would be convened to review the circumstances of the 1981 imprisonment of one Sirius Orion Black. All relevant parties had been notified. The review would proceed in due course, according to Wizengamot procedural guidelines. Harry was thanked for bringing the matter to the department's attention. He folded the letter and put it in the locked envelope with the others. He ate his porridge. He did not say anything for a while. "Well?" Hagrid said eventually. "Well," Harry agreed. The Wizengamot panel convened 4 days later, in chambers Harry would never see, presided over by the Minister for Magic, with the expression of a man who had just sat on something he hadn't noticed before he sat. The Wizengamot had kept records for centuries. Every hearing, every verdict, every sentencing. A search for a hearing regarding Sirius Orion Black, November 1981, produced nothing. No date, no presiding judge, no verdict, no hearing had been convened. What existed instead was a ministerial order, signed in the chaos of late 1981, authorizing the immediate imprisonment of Sirius Black in Azkaban on grounds of mass murder and betrayal. It was correctly formatted. It was not, by the statutes that also existed, a substitute for a trial. No wand examination had been performed. The 12 Muggle deaths, attributed to him, rested on eyewitness testimony, placing him at the scene, not on physical evidence that his wand had produced the fatal spell. Peter Pettigrew had been assumed dead. His body had not been recovered. Only a finger. The Minister for Magic read the summary with the care of someone hoping to find a factual error and not finding one. The Burrow, on a warm afternoon in the 3rd week of August, was in the state of productive chaos that preceded a Hogwarts term. Trunks had been dragged from wardrobes, their contents supplemented with things borrowed from older siblings and things that needed replacing. From the kitchen came the smell of whatever was in the pot. Ron Weasley was in the sitting room attempting to fit a chess set into his trunk, which was technically large enough and practically occupied by 4 other things. He was 11 years old and going to Hogwarts in 10 days, and had been talking about this to anyone who would listen for roughly 11 days. Percy, who had turned 15 3 days ago, and was conducting himself accordingly, was reading in the armchair and offering opinions on the trunk situation that Ron had not asked for. "You could take the chess set out of the box," Percy said, "and wrap the pieces individually." "That's 18 pieces," Ron said. "It would fit." I'm not wrapping 18 pieces individually. Scabbers was in Ron's coat pocket, on the arm of the sofa, apparently asleep, the grey lump of him barely visible above the edge. He was old for a rat and moved slowly, and the family had grown accustomed to finding him in improbable places in states of improbable inertia. From the kitchen, the wizarding wireless was playing something, music, and then the music stopped. "We interrupt the scheduled program," said the voice from the wireless, with the particular gravity reserved for announcements of significance, "to confirm that the Wizengamot has convened an emergency review panel regarding the 1981 imprisonment of Sirius Black. The panel will examine the procedural basis for the imprisonment, following inquiries submitted to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Further details will be provided as they become available." Music resumed. Percy looked up from his book. Ron had stopped trying to fit the chess set into the trunk. In Ron's coat pocket, the rat went very still. Not the stillness of sleep. Scabbers had been still in the manner of sleep, which was the loose, boneless stillness of a creature entirely at rest. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had stopped. Every small animal movement ceased. The faint twitching that accompanied rat dreams, the tiny adjustments of breathing, the slight curl and uncurl of the toes on the front paws. The pocket was very quiet. "Sirius Black," Percy said, with the authority of someone who had been at Hogwarts long enough to know the name's significance. "That's the one who... the traitor. The one who gave Harry Potter's parents to you-know-who." "I know who Sirius Black is," Ron said, though he said it in a tone that suggested he knew it approximately rather than precisely. "They're reviewing it," Percy said, looking at the wireless with an expression that was trying to determine what to think about this. "Reviewing what?" "Whether the imprisonment was done correctly, procedurally." Ron looked at the wireless too. Then he looked at his trunk. "Do you think they'll let him out?" "I don't know," Percy said. "I don't know what they're looking for." Neither of them looked at the sofa. Neither of them noticed the coat pocket. Why would they? Scabbers had been in that pocket, or one like it, for as long as Ron could remember, which was his whole life, and a still rat in a coat pocket was simply a still rat in a coat pocket, which was entirely unremarkable. The rat waited. The radio moved on to something about the International Confederation of Wizards. Percy went back to his book. Ron fitted the chess set into the trunk by removing his spare socks and deciding he'd manage. Scabbers did not move for a very long time. Harry, at the Leaky Cauldron, was not sleeping properly and hadn't been for 10 days since the conversation with Dumbledore. He didn't tell Hagrid. Hagrid read his newspaper at breakfast with the paper held mostly right side up, which was an improvement on previous mornings, and at dinner he told Harry things about Hogwarts, stories that had nothing to do with vaults or trials or prophecies, about the lake and the forest, and the particular incident involving a Niffler and the Transfiguration classroom that McGonagall had never quite forgiven, and Hagrid was still not entirely willing to take full responsibility for. Harry listened. He ate, he read. He thought about Sirius Black, who he had a name for, but no face, a godfather, a guardian, a best friend of James Potter, and a decade of Azkaban. He had the motorbike Hagrid had arrived on, and a photograph with SB and Blex on the back that the Dursleys had taken away. He had Hagrid's word about betrayal, delivered in the voice of someone repeating what he'd been told. He had an insufficient conviction and a Wizengamot panel. It would be enough, or it wouldn't. The Ministry Owl found him at the corner table on a Friday afternoon, dropping a sealed letter into his hands, with the businesslike manner of a bird that had been doing this all week. Harry broke the seal. The Wizengamot panel had completed its review. It had determined that the evidentiary basis for the 1981 ministerial order, imprisoning Sirius Black, was insufficient to constitute a confirmed conviction under standard Wizengamot judicial procedures. Sirius Black's case was accordingly placed on hold, pending further investigation. He was not exonerated. His imprisonment was not ended. The matter remained open. Harry read the word insufficient 3 times. He put the letter down. He looked at Hagrid. "That's not a no," he said. Hagrid looked at the letter. His enormous face was doing several things at once, none of them simple. "No," he said after a moment. "It isn't." Harry nodded. He put the letter in the locked envelope with the others. He ordered dinner. Outside, the August evening was warm and long, and the alley was settling into its end-of-day sounds. Shops closing, an owl going somewhere with purpose, someone on the cobbles below, moving toward wherever they needed to be. Harry ate and didn't say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying right now. The case was moving. That was what tonight required. To register it, and let it be enough, before reaching for the next thing. He was getting better at that. It was not a natural skill. The last 3 weeks had been a particular school, and he had been learning in it. And he was not done learning, but he was further along than he had been when it started. Somewhere in Azkaban, a man Harry had never met was either guilty or not guilty of a thing no one had properly tried him for. Somewhere at the Burrow, 10 days away from Hogwarts, a rat was apparently sleeping in a coat pocket. Harry finished his dinner and went upstairs, and for the first night in a week he slept until morning. Harry wrote 1 line on a piece of parchment, addressed it to Albus Dumbledore, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and gave it to the pub owl. "I'd like to speak with you again, at your convenience. H. Potter." "You're sending for him," Hagrid said. "He came last time, and it was useful," Harry said. "Let's see if it works the other way." Hagrid looked at the owl. He looked at Harry. He had the expression of a man who was still in the process of updating his mental model of certain things, and was finding the updates required more frequently than anticipated. Dumbledore arrived before the end of the day. Harry heard him come in through the main pub, the particular way the room adjusted when he walked into it, as it seemed to whenever he was present, and then the knock on the door of the back room, which had become, over the course of August, something of an office for purposes Harry had not anticipated when the month started. He was at the table with his notes already out. He had been ready since the owl left. Dumbledore sat down across from him. He did not comment on the notes. He folded his hands on the table and waited, and Harry thought, not for the first time, that Dumbledore was very good at waiting, in a way that was probably an asset when you were 100 years old and had been doing this long enough to know that things arrived in their own time. 3 conditions, Harry said, for withdrawing the withdrawal letter. Dumbledore inclined his head. Harry set out the parchment with the conditions written on it, numbered, in order. "First," he said, "a full written account of every withdrawal from Vault 687 since the 1st of November 1981, provided to me by Gringotts and co-signed by you. Not the ledger summary, the full account, with dates and purposes recorded against each entry, along with a repayment schedule negotiated with the goblins for the sum you agree is owed." Dumbledore said nothing. He was reading. "Second," Harry said, "the Sirius Black case proceeds to a full Wizengamot hearing before the end of this school year. Not a review panel, a proper hearing, with evidence and cross-examination, and a verdict that the Wizengamot has actually reached, rather than one a ministry official signed off on in 1981. He paused. Third, I am told the full text of the prophecy before I turn 13, July 1993, at the latest." He stopped speaking. The room was quiet. Dumbledore accepted conditions 1 and 2 without debate, clearly without qualifications. Harry had known he would. They were not, in the end, possible to argue against, and Dumbledore had the dignity not to try. He was quiet for a long time about Condition 3. Harry let him be quiet. He had learned in the last 4 weeks that silence was not an absence of negotiation, but a part of it, and that the thing to do with silence was to wait in it, not fill it. "I understand what you're asking," Dumbledore said finally. "I know you do," Harry said. "There are elements of the prophecy that—" Dumbledore stopped. He tried another direction. "The full text carries implications that, at 11 years old, you may not yet be ready for," Harry said. "Yes." "You said that about the Dursleys," Harry said. "You said it about the vault. Both times the effect was that I was prepared for nothing when I would have preferred to have been prepared." He kept his voice even. "I'm not asking you to tell me tonight. I'm asking you to commit to telling me before I'm 13. You told me the prophecy exists. I'd rather know what it actually says than spend 2 years guessing." Another silence. Dumbledore looked at the parchment. Then he looked at Harry. "By your 13th birthday," he said, "the 31st of July, 1993, I will tell you the full text." Harry wrote it on the parchment. He slid it across the table with the quill. Dumbledore looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the quill and signed his name at the bottom of the 3 conditions, in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had signed a great many things and understood what signatures meant. He set the quill down. There was a small silence. "I have never," Dumbledore said, "been asked to sign a negotiated agreement by someone who was not yet 12 years old." Harry took the parchment back and folded it. "No one should have to." The words sat in the room. Dumbledore did not respond to them immediately, which Harry thought was probably the correct response. The Ministry owl arrived while they were still sitting there. It came to the back room window, which Tom had apparently left unlatched for this purpose, and dropped a sealed Ministry envelope into Harry's hands with the precision of something that had been given very clear directions. Harry broke the seal and read it. Then he set it on the table between them. It confirmed that the Sirius Black case had been officially scheduled for a full Wizengamot hearing. Date: the 14th of November, 1991. Presiding: the full Wizengamot body. Neither Harry nor Dumbledore said anything about it for a moment. "If he's innocent," Harry said finally, "I'm not asking you what happens next. I'm telling you I'll be asking." "I know you will," Dumbledore said. Harry added the Ministry letter to the locked envelope. He walked Dumbledore to the door of the back room. They did not shake hands. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment, with an expression Harry couldn't entirely read, something that was perhaps, on a long enough time scale, something like respect. Then he went out through the pub, and Harry listened to the room settle behind him. He went back to the table and wrote his last letter of August. It was short. It was formal. He was writing to inform the school that his withdrawal letter of the 2nd of August, 1991, was hereby withdrawn, conditional upon the terms signed by Albus Dumbledore at the Leaky Cauldron on this date, copies of which were attached. He would be on Platform 9, 3 to 4, on the 1st of September. He looked forward to beginning his studies. He sent it with the pub owl, which had long since stopped being surprised by anything Harry asked of it. At the Burrow that same evening, Ron Weasley knew none of this. He knew that Hogwarts was in 7 days, and that his trunk still refused to accommodate everything, and that Percy kept coming in under the pretext of borrowing something and staying to offer opinions. He knew his mum had pressed his school robes twice, and that his dad had promised to take him to Diagon Alley for his wand, which was a promise Ron was holding on to with urgency, given that the term was in 7 days, and they had not yet gone. He did not know that the famous Harry Potter had spent the month of August in the Leaky Cauldron negotiating with the headmaster of the school they were both about to attend. He did not know about the vault, or the 3 conditions, or the signed parchment, or Sirius Black's hearing scheduled for November. He was trying to fit his chess set into his trunk, and this was what he knew. Scabbers was in the corner of the room, apparently asleep. Or appearing to be. He had spent most of the past week apparently sleeping in various corners, which was not unusual for Scabbers, though perhaps the stillness was more complete than usual. Ron, who had other things to worry about, hadn't noticed. The chess set did not fit in the trunk. Ron took out his spare socks and tried again. Harry spent his last days of August in the alley. He bought 1 more book, not on the first-year list, a history of the Wizengamot and its procedures, and read it at the corner table with porridge and tea. He walked the alley in the mornings when it was still quiet, learning it the way he had always learned places he might need to know, methodically, with attention. The cauldron shop, and the apothecary, and the owl emporium, and the wand-maker's narrow door. The entrance from inside, and the entrance from the Muggle street that only certain people could see. The way light moved through it at different times of day. He was not at peace, exactly. There were too many threads still open for peace. Sirius's hearing in November, the repayment schedule to be negotiated, the prophecy text still withheld until 1993, the school itself ahead of him full of unknowns. He was not finished. He had the sense that he would not be finished for a long time. But he was not in the cupboard under the stairs either. He was in an alley in London, with a wand in his pocket, and a locked envelope of correspondence in the bottom of his trunk, and 3 conditions in writing that bore the signature of Albus Dumbledore. He noted the difference. It seemed important to note it. On the 31st of August, he packed his trunk, thanked Tom for the room, and shook Hagrid's enormous hand. "You'll write?" Hagrid said. He was doing a valiant impression of a man who wasn't emotional about this. "Yes," Harry said. "And if anything, I'll write," Harry said. Hagrid squeezed his hand once, very carefully, and then let go. Hagrid had offered to come. Harry said, "I'll manage." Hagrid opened his mouth. He closed it. He had spent a month watching Harry manage things that most adults would not have managed, and had no argument to offer, and was finding the absence of an argument considerably harder than the presence of one. "Thank you," Harry said, "for staying for all of it." Hagrid sat down on the pub bench. He looked at Harry with an expression Harry had no particular name for. "You'll write," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'll write," Harry said. He shook Hagrid's enormous hand, and then picked up his trunk and went out into the Muggle street. He took the Underground to King's Cross. He had read about the barrier in one of his Diagon Alley books, and walked at it without breaking stride, and the world shifted briefly, and Platform 934 was there. The Hogwarts Express was scarlet and enormous, and producing a great deal of steam. Families were arranged along the platform, parents, siblings, trunks stacked and owls hooting, children his age doing the particular kind of standing that meant they were excited and trying not to show it. He watched a woman with red hair hug a boy, and then let him go, and then hug him again. He watched a girl accept a kiss on the cheek from both her parents, and then climb aboard without looking back, not from unkindness, but from momentum. It landed somewhere in him that had no name yet. He let it land. The whistle blew. Harry picked up his trunk and found a compartment. It was empty. He was the first one in. He sat down by the window, put his trunk in the rack, and settled. In the bottom of the trunk, underneath his books, was the locked envelope, the vault ledger, the signed conditions, the ministry correspondence, the Sirius hearing notice. He knew what was in it. He did not need to look. The compartment door slid open. She was his age, with a great deal of very bushy brown hair and a bag that was clearly operating well above its designed capacity. She looked at the compartment, then at Harry, with the precise assessment of someone who had already worked out the optimal strategies for train seating, and was now applying them. "Is anyone sitting here?" she said. "No," Harry said. She settled opposite him and began reorganizing her bag with the concentration of a small logistics operation. Then she looked at the book Harry had out. "That's the advanced magical theory text," she said. "It isn't on the first-year list." "I know," Harry said. "Have you read it?" "Most of it. The chapter on transfiguration fundamentals is clearer than the set text." Her expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but that occupied the same territory. She produced her own copy of the set text from her bag. "I thought it was very clear, actually. The notation system is inconsistent in Chapter 4, Harry said. "Yes," she said, with the relief of someone who had noticed a thing and hadn't been sure anyone else had. "Exactly." Her name was Hermione Granger. She had read about Harry Potter, she told him, and then corrected herself. She'd read the published account, which was a different thing, and she'd found it somewhat lacking in specifics. Harry told her he agreed, for reasons he didn't elaborate on. She had read about a great many things. He found this easier than he'd expected. People who had read about things were, in his experience, interested in things outside themselves, which was a quality he found useful. The conversation found its footing. The compartment door opened again before she had got very far into the notation problem. A boy with red hair and freckles and a smudge of something brown on his nose stood in the doorway, looking at the empty seats with the expression of someone who had been rejected by 3 compartments already and was calibrating his expectations accordingly. "Do you mind?" he said. "Everywhere else is full." "Fine," Harry said. He came in and heaved his trunk into the rack and sat down. His coat pocket moved in the way of coat pockets containing animals pretending not to be there. A grey, elderly rat's nose appeared briefly at the edge of the pocket, and then withdrew. Apparently asleep, or appearing to be. Ron Weasley, he introduced himself, was the 6th of 7 children and going to Hogwarts for the first time. He said this with the excitement and self-consciousness of someone who had been waiting for it for approximately all of his conscious memory. He had brothers who had told him things. He had expectations. 20 minutes out of London, the door opened again. The boy was round-faced and earnest, with the quality of someone already apologizing for something before identifying what it was. "Sorry, I've lost my toad. He's called Trevor. You haven't—" Harry and Hermione both looked. Trevor was under Harry's seat, pressed against the wall in the manner of a toad who had achieved his objective of not being found. Harry extracted him and handed him over. "Thank you," the boy said, with considerable relief. He introduced himself as Neville Longbottom, and apologized again, and sat down in the remaining seat in a way that suggested he intended to occupy as little space as possible. Harry thought, "I know what that is." He didn't say it. The train moved through the country. The sky changed the way skies changed in England when you were going north, the light getting different, the clouds assembling with more purpose. Harry watched it for a while, and then watched the compartment, Hermione explaining something to Neville with the care of someone who had noticed that Neville would benefit from it being explained twice, just in different terms. Ron eating something from his pocket. Trevor sitting very still on Neville's knee with the resigned expression of a toad who had accepted his circumstances. And at the bottom of Harry's trunk, a locked envelope. Conditions in writing. A hearing in November. He was not the boy who would have stumbled onto this platform in the other version of this story. Knowing nothing and owning nothing he understood, dazzled by the first kindness anyone had shown him, and prepared to follow it anywhere without question. He was someone who knew his vault's history and his godfather's name, and what it felt like to sit across a table from Albus Dumbledore and wait for him to finish not answering a question. He was going to Hogwarts because he had decided to, on terms he had set, toward a school year that already had 3 items on its agenda outside the curriculum: a vault restitution schedule being negotiated with the goblins, a Wizengamot hearing in November, and a prophecy text to be disclosed in 1993 at the latest. He was also in a train compartment with 2 people who had read extensively about things that interested them, and 1 person who had lost a toad and been glad to have it returned, and the particular quality of stillness in Ron's coat pocket that Harry had learned to notice by now. The train moved north through September countryside, the light doing what light did in England when summer was almost over. Harry sat with the compartment sounds and was present in them. Voices, steam, wheels on rail, Trevor shifting on Neville's knee. Because he had learned this month that where you were was worth knowing and worth being in, rather than always ahead of yourself or behind. The story he was supposed to live was already not the story he was living.